Hi there, this is Amaka and Ku with the If Not Now When podcast series. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Yemi Dipeolu, who is a special advisor to the president on economic matters. Now, it's important to understand that the goal of this conversation was to get a sense of how some policymakers are thinking about government policymaking and the challenges that they face. It was not intended to be a discussion specifically about the current administration, whether its successes or its failings. That will be a separate conversation that we will have with other economic analysts. If you have suggestions for analysts to have that conversation with, please let us know. In the meantime, enjoy the conversation, and as usual, let us know your thoughts. I wanted to start this conversation with a broad conceptual question that developing governments everywhere often struggle with: the appropriate role of government in the economy. Can you walk us through how you think about this question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amaka. I'm happy to be here. I think the most important thing I want to say is that there is a tendency to see the relationship between governments and markets as exclusive. And I would say it's not either or, it's both and. In other words, government certainly has a major role to play in providing macroeconomic stability, in providing a vision for society, in helping to coordinate economic activity. But government cannot successfully, in many instances, run private activity because it doesn't have the knowledge, it has agency problems, and there are difficulties that emerge in the process of government trying to do everything. But I think it's a question of also time and space. So there's a time in which governments, for instance, early independence in Africa, tabula rasa, you have to get many sectors up and running. So you try to intervene. Same thing in Korea, same thing in Japan. So Meiji Japan, of course, was different from Japan of today. So the role of government changes. So if you're at the start of the economic transformation, of course, government will do more things. You want to build power plants, you want to do steel plants, you want to educate your children, you want to stimulate manufacturing, but as time goes on and some of those things take off, as you found in other societies, then government begins to move out of some of those areas. So I would say, yes, government has a key role to play. Mobilizing resources for development, providing macroeconomic stability, and helping people to understand, providing what I call normative standards. In other words, helping society to know that we must work together on a common value system that allows us to do business successfully, that kind of thing.
Right. So where do you think we are in Nigeria now? In this sort of, you're describing a bit of a spectrum, right? Like initially government needs to kind of provide the start, provide the norms, provide the guidelines, but it can't really run the businesses, but it has to provide the incentives, right? So where are we in Nigeria? What do you think the government is doing effectively? And what do you think it needs to do better in terms of driving economic transformation?
Again, thank you. I don't think one can really answer that question without taking a historical perspective, in the sense that in the post-independence era, it was clear that government was trying to do many things. They had marketing boards, they had import substitution, industrialization policies, they had policies for education, policies for health. Indeed, they even owned hotels. And I think it was the 1970 National Development Plan spoke about government controlling the commanding height of the economy, controlling banking, controlling certain sectors. Yes, the petroleum sector.
You mean that it was an objective of government, you said, in the 1970s? Yes, it was the
National Development Plan to control the commanding heights of the economy and to build self-reliance in certain sectors. But then you moved along that, some pretty good levels of success. But then you ran into the economic shock, the debt crisis, the foreign exchange crisis. So you move into the structural adjustment program. And then the debate is on as to all those privatization that took place, all those cutting back of the role of the state. Were they not too early In other words, you transferred a lot of things to the private sector. Was it not too early in the sense to stop supporting manufacturing, for instance, and leaving it to its own devices? Trade liberalization, ab initio. So those questions arise, rolling back the role of the state so that you find that the public sector is not as powerful or strong or as useful as it could be in helping to drive development. So I would say that journey, I think, caused a lot of disruption, so to speak. And I think, to be quite candid, not only Nigeria, but a lot of us are trying to pick up the pieces in terms of what should be the complete policy package that countries like ours should adopt.
So you're saying that you think Nigeria moved too early to roll back, to liberalize. So tell me more about that, because there's an argument that a lot of the things Nigeria was doing was ineffective, was inefficient, and so it needed to liberalize. So tell me why you think it was too early.
Excellent. Okay, let's take 3 areas, for instance. The first, I think, which we all saw, was in the liberalization of the foreign exchange markets. So we liberalized the foreign exchange markets. Maybe we had some supply issues, but we liberalized it, and since 1986, we've been struggling to get the right foreign exchange regime right. So again, I'm not saying that the other extreme of the fixed exchange rate is necessary,
right?
But maybe you may liberalize too early until you have found out what works for you. Second was trade liberalization. You basically allowed everything to the economy: second-hand clothes, second-hand cars, goods from all over the world. So you killed your textile industries, which are the greatest employers of labor. You had over 1 million people maybe working in the textile sector. Maybe today, if we have 20-something thousand, we'll be lucky. So the point being that you liberalized trade, you liberalized the banking sector. May have worked to some extent, in the sense that now you had lots of new bankers. But then you still have a problem with how do you manage interest rates in such a way that they do not kill production. So borrowing at 25 to 30%, I don't think really helps industry. And Bank of Industry, fantastic institution. There's a limit to how many people it can lend money to within the economy. So I've spoken about exchange rates, I've spoken about interest rates, I've spoken about trade, but there's even the whole problem of the privatization. So if you look at the privatized enterprises, I think the banks have done well. I want to be candid about that.
Are we talking about privatization since the transition to democratic rule?
I'm telling you about how we may have liberalized too early. And I'm saying that some sectors, that maybe banking led to some contribution to the economy, but maybe over financialization, because then you are not able to finance things that need patient capital. You are trying to finance things that will bring your returns back very, very quickly. And so you have to ask yourself that, was that the speed at which you needed to move? For instance, just to give a crude example, Korea in 1960 nationalized their banks so that the banks could be a source of credit for the industrial sector. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that various countries, various times, various things. So now you have a very fairly active financial sector, perhaps, but nearly all the other privatized sectors are not really doing well. Maybe LME, which was bought and now exports to the year, but you will be hard put. Even the simpler things like the hotels and things are really not doing as well as they should do.
What would have been the alternative? So let's just take foreign exchange as one that is still a live issue today, right? If you didn't liberalize it, I mean, some people would argue that it's not even liberalized today, right? Because the central bank is still effectively controlling exchange rates, and there are reasons for that. Like I would argue, basically, central bank is the only supplier of dollar, right? Even if they wanted to liberalize it, there's nobody else to supply dollars, right? But what would be the alternative in your view?
No. I'm not even saying that at all. Okay. I was talking about the historical perspective.
Historical, right, okay.
But then you didn't, when you moved now, you just devalued rather than put in place a mechanism by which the foreign exchange market will sort of stabilize itself vis-a-vis supply and demand. So we always try to sort of control it a bit. When it gets too much, we say, no, now it's 23 or it's 23 naira, 24 naira, dollar. So we're always moving back and forth. Compare with Kenya since the early 1990s. If you check the Kenyan exchange rate of shillings to the dollar, you'll find a band between 1990 and today, a band of between 80 Kenyan shillings to 115 Kenyan shillings, 120 Kenyan shillings. So that band is relatively narrow. Because I'm not saying that they liberalize, but they liberalize after putting certain things in place to ensure demand, to build confidence in that market. So even when you talk about central bank trying to peg, is because they're trying to prevent it from going out of control.
Right.
But in trying to prevent it from going out of control, perhaps you're frightening people away from the market as well. So it's pretty complicated. I sympathize with them really, but
So let me close the loop on this, because I want to make sure people understand what you're saying. Because I think a lot of people are going to listen to this and say, "Oh, they want to nationalize everything and they don't want the government." I know. So listen, I want to make sure. So I want to make sure people understand, right? I think what you're saying is, if you go back to the historical evolution of how Nigeria's government approached the economy and approached the market, you think they made a certain mistake historically in the 80s that has led to structural issues that we see today in some sectors, right? That doesn't mean that we want to go back and turn back the clock. You're saying that those are mistakes that created certain distortions that became difficult to come back from. So let me just, I think the trade liberalization one is clear. You're saying basically by liberalizing textiles too early, they lost a lot of jobs, they created a lot of economic dislocations. But what would have been, just so I think people, I don't quite understand the foreign exchange one, right? Like what do you think the impact was in the 80s that was distortive? Like what do you think they could have avoided by not liberalizing then? Does that make sense, my question?
No, I think I must make myself clear. I'm not arguing against liberalization of anything or all things. Right. I'm saying that you do it in a way that fits with your objectives, long-term and medium-term. So, for instance, to use the foreign exchange market, just to go back there, we started with the second-tier foreign exchange market. So again, we still try to allocate to what we thought were important sectors at a particular rate, and we allowed the second-tier market to go on. So in other words, we've always sort of had an official parallel rate. And I'm saying that would that have been the best possible approach to go on to it? I think there were several aspects of liberalization that were important for the Nigerian economy. I'm clear about that. Certain sectors certainly benefited. Some sectors did not. But the point I'm really trying to make is I'm talking about timing. That you move steadily rather than big bang. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. You sort of say that this sector needs to grow and this sector needs to grow along these lines. So guess what? Textiles, I'm going to open you up. But I'm going to open you up in 5 years. And you have to meet certain metrics every year. And we were doing that with the auto industry. The auto industry had gotten to a stage where we were producing batteries, we were producing glass, we had tire factories in Nigeria, right? But then if we opened up that market immediately, the auto industry then was swamped by competition from foreign cars. And then subsequently, the batteries factories had to close down. The tire factories had to close down. The glass factories had to close down, whereas the backward integration had started already. So I'm saying that maybe with a bit more deliberateness.
That's
a little bit more deliberateness, that we need to do this, but we need to do this in a very deliberate manner rather than just big bang approach. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make.
No, that's fair, and I think that's clear. I'm glad you've clarified that. So with that in mind, right, how do you think we should be thinking about government's role in the economy going forward? So I hear, hearing you and sort of, look, your point is there is a role for government to play in the economy. It's not necessarily running everything. Nobody's arguing for command and control. There's a certain level of deliberation, of sort of setting a foundation, and then, encouraging competition and so on and so forth. So what do you think that looks like if you were, what do you think that should be looking like today? Maybe taking just some of the key industries or key sectors, right?
Let me put it this way. I think there are 5 things that I think a government should do as it tries to develop a country.
Right.
I think the standard one, which nobody would debate, is to provide macroeconomic stability. It's the volatility in prices, inflation, in exchange rates, in debt, that sort of makes it difficult for people doing business to understand the environment. And then they begin to take short-term perspectives rather than long-term perspectives. They try to watch their back, so to speak. So I think that's key, like the story goes, if you read all the literature, that during depressions, for instance, the Korean government, during recessions, would support businesses, first and foremost, manufacturers, first and foremost, that you're not going to feel the weight of this external shock, because we have to make sure that we continue to produce. Right? So the second thing I would say government must do is to play an entrepreneurial role. You must provide a vision. And you see that we've tried that to be candid. Where are you taking society to? And you provide the vision not by imposing it, but by consulting with people and saying, look, what kind of society are we trying to build? Not done in a mechanistic manner, but in a holistic manner that encourages people, that feels that they have a stake. And as part of that vision, of course, you then help to mitigate risk. You help to say, look, if you go into this new sector, I'm going to give you a pioneer incentive or something. Right? Again, not generalized, but specific sectors that can help to transform the economy. You also help them to raise resources. So I call that playing the entrepreneurial role. The role of the entrepreneur is to have a vision, is to provide resources, it's to help to mitigate risk or find ways of mitigating risk. I think very, very important role for government to play as change happens is as a conflict manager. And I'm not talking about...
So that's number 3. Right.
Yes, I'm not talking about insecurity here. Yeah. I'm talking about managing the conflict between what I call capital and labor. So as you move out of certain sectors, people begin to lose their jobs, for instance. People begin to feel that they're not paid relative to other sectors. So you have to think through, how do you help to manage those social relations, as it were, so that those whose factories have to close because they're no longer efficient, those whose sectors are being pushed out by more dynamic sectors. How do the people, because, hey, if I trained as a typist and then the world is moving to computer programming, then I think government has a role to help me to find my way as in that new emerging world. Right. Shouldn't be left to my own devices. So I'm going to train you as a computer programmer because you know how to type, you know what the keyboard looks like. So you're a natural data person, but you don't know how a computer looks like. So no private person is going to provide those kind of resources to people because I train you, you go and work for somebody else. I've lost money. I was saying that, ideally, if you want to have a developmentalist agenda, governments to act as the conflict manager, but not in the sense of peace and security now, but in the sense of social relations, in the sense of if people are losing their jobs due to changing economic changes, you help to mitigate their feeling of alienation. So when I use the example of the typist, that ideally if someone has learned to type and the world is moving out of typewriters into computers, you then as the state have to sort of help the people to acquire the skills that will enable them to be computer programmers or data analysts. Whereas no private sector person is going to spend his money giving you those skills. Because if it gives you the skills and you go away, it's basically a loss.
Right. So
that's the point I was making.
So before you move to number 4, right? So you've talked about 5 things that you think government should be doing. First was macroeconomic stability, provide a vision, because I think the vision component relates to the conflict manager role, right? Because the whole idea is that people often forget that economic transformation is ugly, it's messy, it involves losers, it involves a lot of disgruntlement. So yeah, winners too, but it's not everybody will be winners. There'll be lots of losers who are unhappy and who try to stop the transformation, right? And so the way you manage that is by having a vision that you keep reminding people and that you get everybody to buy into, right? And so the reason I wanted to stop here and like tease that out a little bit, because anytime you talk about vision with Nigerian politicians, they'll tell you, well, there's Vision 2030, right? We have a vision. It's on paper. Look at the paper. So tell me why that's not what you're talking about. Are you talking about?
It's actually what I'm talking about.
Okay.
But it must be all encompassing. So if you look at the ERGP or the ESP, let's use the ESP as an example. The ESP is the Economic Sustainability Plan. There is an attempt to ensure that you can give skills to young people in the technological space, in the digital space.
Right.
In other words, there are policies to try and help in the creative industry. So it's not just about education now, but even after you finish the education, there are programs that are intended to help bring you up to speed around the creativity, around use of computers. So we have this program coming up called the iDice, which is investing in digital and creative enterprises. A basic component of that is skills, imparting skills to young people. So you may not have learned how to program in school. You may not have learned how to operate a movie camera in school. But then you have this program that gives support, working with our institutions to enable young people to move to the digital economy. I just use that as an example.
Yeah. I tend to think it's not enough to have these plans on paper, right? So when I think about a vision, I think about something that speaks to everyone, that everybody can buy into and everybody understands. So that it's like there's a clear message. I'm trying to think of like what would be a good example. China's common prosperity. I don't know if that's, kind of something that like that easily speaks to everybody, and the government keeps reiterating, this is the vision, we're going to be in this kind of country in 30 years, and this is how we're going to get there, and these are the compromises we need to make. I don't see that happening in Nigeria.
It's there. You are touching on something. It's there if you look closely at those plans. The truth of the matter is some of them are written by highly academic people, and so you are not communicating effectively. But they are developed through a genuinely inclusive process, trying to talk to various sectors, trying to talk to various segments of society to try and get their inputs to the kind of society they want to see. And by and large, if you look at the documents closely, they sort of capture this idea. But I know what you are talking about, and it's linked to what I was trying to talk about next, which was establishing the normative standards.
Okay, so that's number 4.
Which, if you like, you can call ideology. That we are going to become a developmental state. We are having a national war, guess what, against poverty.
We are
having, as in Korea, I can't remember the phrase they used, but I get what, so I know what you mean. They call it Harip Jonge, but I don't know what it translates to in English anymore.
Right.
But the point being that, basically mobilizing people around the common vision, which is what the negative people that we know, the fascists, the hard communists, what they did in the past. Also mobilizing people around that vision. So mobilizing our people around the common vision, I totally agree with you. So maybe it's the way we communicate it.
Right.
Maybe it's the fact that we haven't put it in a very simple, guess what? Nigeria is going to be the leading manufacturing economy in Africa in 20 years. And that means jobs, but it also means sacrifices. It also means acquiring the skills to work in industry. It also means teaching our children engineering.
Exactly. And here are the things we're doing to advance that vision, not just putting it on paper, and like communicate No. I'm saying the
point,
communication
it goes to a
part.
point I was going to make, that in all this, perhaps the single greatest important thing is state capacity.
So is that number 5? Oh no, you haven't.
No. State capacity is almost like a way of getting
everything.
Done.
Right.
Yes, it's a way of getting things done. So if you're acting as a conflict manager, the guys in charge of, say, labor relations, maybe the guys in some countries they have the social contract. In South Africa they have NEDLAC that brings the social partners together to try and manage that. So various societies have done it in various ways. The fifth one I was going to talk about was specifying property rights.
Okay.
Let me put it crudely. In other words, this is the way you can make money legitimately and relatively smoothly. In other words, it's not property rights about saying I'm a rich man, don't touch my money. No. It's about saying that, guess what? If you want to be a contractor, you may make a bit of money, but you're not going to make too much money. But if you're going to be a manufacturer, guess what? You may get all the foreign exchange you need. If you want to be a technology guy, you may get all the tax breaks you need. In other words, so that's perhaps more than anything else, what I would say about the conflict, the property rights issue, because sometimes some people see property rights as protecting the rights of those who are rich already. But I'm using it in the sense of telling you the ways in which you are going to be able to undertake productive activities rather than rent-seeking activities. So I encourage you. So this is, if you want tax breaks, go and produce goods. If you want preferential allocation of certain things, be a producer rather than a user. That kind of thing.
So I think the critical blocks here, right, is this question of, like, you said it yourself. All of this requires state capacity, right? In order for the government to play this sort of stimulative, productive role in the economy, you need to have a capable state. Absolutely. And I think that sometimes is where things can go wrong in Nigeria, right? Can a Nigerian government play this role when it doesn't really have a capable state? It doesn't really have a deep, competent bureaucracy that is well paid, right? Like, it's a chicken and egg problem. Like, how do you actually do this without a competent state? Or how do you answer that? How do you think about that?
Good question. You remember I vetted to it at the very beginning. I said rolling back the state before the state was ready. So you took actions that basically reduced the role of this. You taught people to think all you have to do is to snap your fingers and solutions will come. The value and everything is okay. Roll back the state, privatize and everything is okay. And then what you end up with is you reduce civil service salaries just by devaluation alone. So you've turned a man who was earning $1,000 to a man who's earning $250. Yeah, I'm equivalent. I'm just, but the point I'm trying to make is that, so we've eroded state capacity over time. But in fairness, it's one thing I can say that we are really trying to do. It takes a long time. In China, Confucius was the guy who started building a solid bureaucracy, but it's doable. I think it's doable. And I think we started, the head of service has done a great job on trying to retrain civil servants, on trying to focus on their welfare needs, on trying to extract performance from them, trying to motivate them, trying to give them equipment they need, but it will take time. But it started, it's been recognized, and one of the things I like about that effort now is that a key member of the private sector, Mr. Aigimo Kwede, through his foundation, is really providing that support. So what you find is that annually now, civil servants are applying to those programs and doing well in those programs that help to give them the skills they need to cope in the modern era. So it will take a bit of time, but that effort is recognized, that need is recognized, and I'm optimistic that it would happen.
So do you think that there is a sequencing issue here as well? Do you think that Nigeria needs to focus first on raising the revenue it needs, improving its state competence, paying people better, and then sort of taking a more active role in the economy? Or do you think it needs to happen How do you think about it? It needs to happen simultaneously?
No. You don't have the luxury of sequencing. You have to learn to talk while you walk. I mean, it's just, that's the challenge, I think, of governance. Is how do you balance short term with long term? But perhaps also equally important, how do you coordinate within government so that the guy who is educating children is educating them to work in the digital economy, so to speak? In other words, as now that's why planning is important, properly done. So that, look, I'm heading in this direction. I'm going to need the skills that help me to work in that direction, right? I'm going to need the resources that help me to retrain people to work in that new direction. So everything is interlinked. I'm going to need a health system that underpins workers that are productive, healthy, and motivated. So, and guess what? I'm going to need power to enable those factories I'm trying to encourage. So you have to just learn to talk as you walk.
To do both.
You have to do it simultaneously. And that's the challenge, I think.
What about the people who say, because there's this sense, especially on social media in Nigeria, that the government is too big. The government is everywhere. And all we really need in Nigeria is to just get the government out of the way and things will work. So tell me why. I mean, I have some thoughts too, but tell me why you think what is wrong with that thinking?
Okay, two things I want to say. The first is that it's been established that government in Nigeria is actually very small. Even just starting from the revenue to GDP ratio, you only control 7-8% of GDP. That's small. In some countries, government to GDP, revenue to GDP ratio is 35% in the developed world and about 17% in other parts of Africa. So you really cannot say that the Nigerian government is too big. Now, the question is, if it's too big, and I think that's the question you're really asking, is why is sometimes the public, why do they want government out of the way? Right. And I think it's because whether we like it or not, Nigerians have become largely self-organizing, by which I mean they make arrangements for their own power, they make arrangements for their own water, they make arrangements for their own security. So sometimes they believe that, look, if you're not going to solve this problem for me, please get out of the way. But the truth of the matter is that it's an inefficient way to tackle large-scale things that require economies of scale. And I know that the public is usually impatient for results in difficult economic terms. And so what they just don't want is, look, get out of my way, as you said. Look, less hassles, less regulations, right? And then a more certain policy environment, stop changing the rules in the middle of the game, so to speak. But the truth of the matter is that you do need regulation if you are going to have order in any business sector. So I'm not going to, we are not going to, for instance, let's use the medical profession. We are not going to say anybody can be a doctor if you want to be a doctor. Just get up and go. Right. There must be some regulation around that. Anybody cannot just be a banker just because you feel like lending money to people. So there must be some modicum of regulation in the modern economy. The question is, how do we do it in a way that it's not a hassle, it's not used to harass or to extort? I think it's the key challenge. Certainly, we shouldn't be driving around without a properly regulated road system. People have been licensed. People know how to use road signs and things like that. So I agree that there's some impatience when things are not the best. But I also feel that there is some need for regulation. Well, certainly a more certain policy environment. If policies are going to change, the reasons should be clear, and where possible, consultations should take place so that people know why it's being changed and why it would actually benefit them in the long run.
What do you think is the biggest? So I think to your point, people feel that way of having to deliver those services for themselves, right? That's your point. It's like, it's not, it's not just, the aversion is because, well, you haven't provided my electricity, you haven't, so why are you even here? Just get out, right? I think that, like you said, if you look at the numbers, the reality is that a lot of Nigerian economic sectors actually don't have a lot of government participation, right? Like, it's not like government owns banks or like owns,
Exactly.
even healthcare. So many of our sectors are like pretty much private sector driven.
Yeah,
the problem is really more sort of some of the rules that, small, medium enterprises have to abide by, too much discretion, and it leads to extortion and all of these things. So what do you think, thinking about that, what do you think, having been in government, and what do you think people in government fail to understand about how to communicate or how to address these issues so that people outside of government can better sort of understand these challenges while giving the government time to fix them? Does that make sense? Like, what is missing there's a disconnect, right, between, I think, Nigeria's government and its people, just in terms of the perceptions, right? People inside government are like, what are you talking about? Government is not too big. People outside government are like, well, government, you're the problem, right? So
No,
what's missing?
I think
disconnect?
you're onto something, and the solutions actually are society-wide. They're probably education-wide. There's the belief that government, and I'm going to use some three big words, I'll try and break them down. Mm-hmm. The government is omniscient, government is benevolent, and government is omnipotent. In other words, there's the belief that government knows everything. They can see X and Y. You and I know that there's a lot of information asymmetry. So there are things that government does not know and will never know. And that would impact on the way the economy is working. So for instance, if a recession is looming from outside Nigeria, you cannot know the impact on you. When Russia went into Ukraine, nobody knew that it would automatically translate to $100 fuel prices, because you didn't know how long it would last and you didn't know the nature of the conflict. That's one example. The other example is that the truth is that there are agency problems in government. In other words, it's not everything that it's not everything that occurs that is, everybody's not on the same page.
Right.
In other words, people are chasing different objectives, sometimes legitimate.
Right. That's an important point. Yeah.
I was reading some book in China about how those who wanted to go for fast growth were being pulled back by the senior economic minister. It's too much. We're going to have inflation. We're going to have destability. And then Xiaoping, who was moderating that, was playing it safe in the middle and trying to see how to find a safe land. I found it very instructive in the sense that we always just assume that government is one whole behemoth and agrees on something and goes the other way. And that's the other thing about omnipotence. Assuming that once government says this must happen, it will happen. No, there's a lot between articulation of policy and actual implementation. And even when you implement successfully, there's no automatic link to the outcomes that you get, because you know better than everybody, economics is not physics.
Right.
So you find even in the Western world today that the Fed worries about at what time should I begin to increase interest rates? Will I increase them too fast and take us sharply into a recession? They just have to feel their way around it. But we've grown to believe that government is all powerful, can solve problems, just take it on board and it will happen. And so I think we need in society to also understand that government has its own limitations. Not to even talk about revenue challenges, but the limitations. Government is not a person, so to speak.
Right.
So the point I'm trying to make is, so economy-wide, we also have to stop expecting government to be able to do everything that needs to be done. I haven't even spoken about state capacity at all, which is linked to the whole issue of the omnipotence and the all-powerful state. If you cannot get things done, how can you be all-powerful?
I think there's a fascinating tension there, though, that this conversation is highlighting, which is that people think the government can't do anything while thinking that it can do everything, right? There's this interesting tension that really depends on what you're talking about, right? Like, they don't want the government to be, involved in certain things, but they want the government to fix all the things that are not to solve all of our problems, right?
Exactly.
And so it's an interesting tension but I think that it boils down to this failure of communication from the government. And I think that one of the things, like, if I were to answer one of the questions I asked you, which is that one of the things that Nigerian governments successively over time have been really poor at is just communicating clearly on what their priorities are, what they're doing, how they're achieving, like constantly communicating, right? Because that brings people along and helps people better understand. When you don't communicate, people create their own stories about what you're doing, right? I mean, you tell me, you look like you're like trying to process that a bit. Like, I think that's a big problem for Nigeria.
I agree, except that, again, the danger of the single story, in the sense that, yes, perhaps communication is part of the problem, but perhaps there's a great degree of cynicism, perhaps from a lack of trust. Yeah. That even when you are giving the message, it's not being absorbed because people don't want to hear what you have to say, or because you're not saying what people would like to hear. And again, there are different publics, so as you communicate, you may be connecting with some parts of the public who see the point, but there are those who are almost, viscerally don't want to have anything to do with you, don't believe you as a government for whatever reasons. And so if they drive that narrative, there's very little you can do. So, like, give you an example, I hope it's not going to get me into trouble. But I remember giving a TV interview some 3-4 years ago, and I said work had started on the second Niger bridge. And I was met with a collective disbelief, Then over a year or two later, the work was going on the subsea structures or the underwater structures. But when it now emerged and grew up, nobody came to me to say, we are sorry. They just didn't believe me at that time. So, I mean, I understand it. I understood it. So it's one of the things I was going to say that, when our people are angry about government, one thing they want is they don't like excuses.
Right.
And they want visible evidence of support and effort. Visible evidence of effort.
So it goes with both, yeah.
They always, Nigerians will say, look, they are trying now. They made an effort. So that visible evidence of effort, I think, is critical. When you're doing something about it, you're trying to tackle it.
It sounds like what you're saying, this is important because I also want people to understand how people inside government feel, like the challenges they feel or they see in terms of communicating, right? So you're saying that people inside government also see that sometimes even when you're trying to communicate, it's very hard to actually get the message across, right? I think that makes sense. That's an important point. And I still think that there are two things, right? It's like the cynicism, the disillusionment is so deep because of the years of underperformance and even, I would say, poor communication, that I think you need a government, and it's not just a government that is really committed to communicating a vision. Even when people are saying, sorry, you're not going to do it, you keep pushing it, and then you show, and then you combine the communication with actually getting the things done, right? And then that will build trust.
Well, I'm saying that, look, the truth of the matter is, and let's take the homegrown school feeding program. Again, when we started, I remember going for some event, and I said, look, we started with homegrown school feeding. And I think we started in Anambra State. And someone from Anambra in the audience was so angry with me. He said, no, it's not so. And I'm saying, I have it for a fact. Because one of the things we did was, rather than just trying to implement, we were working with the state governments. They were choosing the coordinators. They were choosing, even helping to recruit some of the cooks and identifying, the schools, how you start and the things you need to do. So the point I'm trying to make is that very often you might find that even when the effort has started, until it really becomes something that takes off,
Right.
Once you are met it with cynicism, and the truth of the matter is it's very difficult to hit your head against the wall too many times, and you're just hoping that you will be able to, after a while, show that, look, you see what I was talking about.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the solutions I've heard recently is actually that, and this was from Governor El-Rufai, that you should get rid of the Federal Communications or Information Ministry and just force every ministry and every government department to do their own communication. Because the one ministry can't appropriately communicate for everybody, right? And it gets sort of, you get caught up in the whole politics of, well, Information Ministry is supposed to communicate. No, we are supposed to communicate, right? And so on and so forth. To me, that sounds like a potential interesting solution. What do you think?
Well, I don't want to go that way. Who am I to comment on what the governor has said? And who am I to comment on government structures? All I would say is that I don't think, again, it's an either or.
Right.
In the sense that if you coordinate properly and the information comes from a coordinated structure, you are doing two things. The first thing you are doing is that you are helping the various components to know what it is that they need to say.
Right.
But you're also helping the various components not to go outside there and say different things.
Okay, well, we're at the hour, so I think this seems to be a good place to wrap it up. So thank you very much for your time. So hopefully we'll have you back to talk about other things, maybe when you're outside of government, and we can ask you some more pointed questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I was happy to be here.
Thank you for being a part of today's interesting program. You can learn more about the NESG's If Not Now When campaign at www.ifnotnowwhen.ng. You can also listen to other interesting conversations by visiting www.nesggroup.org/podcasts.